Let's go! New name in the defensive coordinator search. Is this the heir apparent to Bo Pelini? Also, one big name officially off the board. One huge returnee to LSU. And we'll give this just a little bit of time. 2020 Alabama versus 2019 LSU. Let's go. Go on ahead, subscribe to the channel. Mississippi State's Zach Arnett is in the mix for LSU's vacant defensive coordinator position, according to Ben Portnoy of the Columbus Dispatch. And Zach Arnett, in his first year as a Mississippi State defensive coordinator. And as you can see here, Arnett says it's just a conversation. Well, a source says Arnett says it's just a conversation. And, you know, when you look at Zach Arnett statistically, this is from my buddy Posier. I'll admit to not knowing a ton about Arnett. I would too. But I do know Mississippi State went from 12th to 5th in yards per play and 12th to 6th in scoring defense in his first season. So the guy can coach. And you continue here. Arnett is from San Diego State University. His defense ranked 7th nationally in yards per play. And as many of you know, this is my favorite statistic in judging defensive efficiency. And 2nd in scoring defense. So two different metrics. And he was good in both of them. But I do want to add on this comment from, obviously, a Mississippi State fan. He's good, but I'm not sure he deserves all the credit. Bob Shoop, some of you have mentioned his name to me, had to replace the All-Star 2018 defense, and he did it despite the offense going 3 and out on every drive. Remember, this was year 2 of the Joe Moorhead offense when they had Garrett Schrader as their quarterback, a true freshman who's not even at the program anymore. And what Jason is mentioning is that the defense lost Montez Sweat, Jeffrey Simmons. So let's take a deep look at the Zach Arnett resume. So as you see here, 34 years of age, born in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I love Albuquerque, by the way. You should go. A big MMA city, but also a city with some of the worst drivers I've ever seen. We move on. San Diego State, San Diego State, San Diego State, and Mississippi State. So, yes, you are hiring a defensive coordinator with a lot of experience for a 34-year-old, and you're getting younger, which is the opposite of Bo Pelini. This is a guy on the ascent. That is something that a lot of you guys want from your defensive coordinator. He did lose guys like Cameron Dantzler to the NFL draft. So he lost some really good players. Willie Gay, who we just mentioned a minute ago. And this defense was still good. And some of you guys have mentioned Bob Shoop's name as the next defensive coordinator. He is the opposite of Zach Arnett. 20 years his senior. But as you can tell here, I mean, just a grinder. Look at all the stops he's made. Look at all the defensive coordinator experience. And he is a safeties coach at Michigan. And as you can see here, multiple stops in the SEC. He's been the defensive coordinator at 3 different SEC schools. Now, if you are interested, we did just release a defensive coordinator 2.0 list, some new names, including one from Tulsa. If you've never heard of Joseph Gillespie, we had a full breakdown on him yesterday, and you could find that link down below. So according to ESPN's Chris Lowe, Tennessee is hiring Kevin Steele, the former Auburn defensive coordinator. It doesn't specify if he's actually going to be the defensive coordinator, and a lot like LSU, Tennessee is under investigation for off-the-field junk. So, Kevin Steele, you know, some of you wanted him to come back to LSU. Well, he didn't spend that much time at LSU during his last stop, and by time, I mean 1 year. So, you know, I don't know if Kevin Steele would have been the answer. At Auburn, he was making $2.5 million, but I must include that his defenses were really freaking good at Auburn. So, as you can see, Auburn's yards per play dropped off, which, happens when you lose Derrick Brown. But 5.62 yards per play, which obviously isn't all that great. But then you look at Mississippi State, on a yards per play basis, they were pretty daggum good. And you also got to factor in how many plays did Mississippi State run. The play differential is about the same. So both of these teams played at a fast pace. Both of these teams averaged over 70 plays per game defensively. The reason why Zach Arnett, to me, is the candidate right now is because Ed Orgeron realized something last year. Bo Pelini had never been the defensive coordinator with a fast-paced offense. And this is something that we get wrong all the time whenever we name defensive coordinator candidates. We don't consider who they are the defensive coordinator with. Now, if you watch our defensive coordinator 2.0 piece from yesterday, I explain that I do not want a guy like Jim Leonhard, who is a defensive coordinator with a slow-paced offense. It's a lot easier to be dominant defensively when your offense doesn't play at a fast pace. So, when you hire a guy like Zach Arnett, or when you interview him, he has experience with an offense that plays at the fastest pace humanly imaginable with our boy Mike Leach. And on top of that, Mike Leach does not have the best culture at Mississippi State, evidenced by some of his off-the-field comments and by the brawl at the end of their bowl game against Tulsa. So, it's interesting. We talked about Joseph Gillespie yesterday, the defensive coordinator for Tulsa, who we're very interested in. And Zach Arnett was the other defensive coordinator in that game. I think both of them would like a fresh start, especially after that very ugly ending of a football game. But my counter to that comment about Zach Arnett is that it was just 1 year at Mississippi State. And if you go look at the San Diego State numbers, they played at a slow pace. Their defense only played 61 plays per game. LSU got some huge news when this player decided to return, and I'm so excited. Like, I am ridiculously excited about this. Austin Deculus. Look at this. I'm ridiculous. That's so good. I like a good pun. Deculus returns. That means 4 of the 5 starters on LSU's offensive line from last year has decided to return to the team. We are still waiting to hear what left tackle Dare Rosenthal is going to decide to do. There could be a scenario where LSU returns a ton of starters from last year's team. The only starters that would be leaving, Jabril Cox, Jacoby Stevens, and Terrace Marshall from last year's team. So, obviously, that's pretty freaking huge. Now, of course, there's some other starters like Zach Van Rosenberg and Racey McMath, but overall, this team is returning a lot. And as we've pointed out before, the biggest indicator of whether LSU can compete for a national championship are returning starters. You go look at the numbers. We did a whole episode on it. I reference it a lot. This was before we really had anyone watching our channel. It was episode 9 of this very channel, where I broke down how many draft picks LSU had the year before coincides with how bad the team is the very next year. And last year, of course, LSU had its most draft picks ever by a considerably high margin. But what concerns me is that both on offense and defense, they're going to be playing in a new scheme. Now, obviously, offensively, that's not going to be as big of a jump as it is defensively because they're going back to the Joe Brady offense, which a lot of the players are familiar with. And then, obviously, defensively, that's going to be a bigger gap because who they bring in as a defensive coordinator is going to more than likely not be like Bo Pelini at all. 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama. Let's get to it. Here's Andrew Hutchinson. This is an Arkansas writer. He just won Arkansas Writer of the Year. This is his breakdown of 2019 LSU and 2020 Alabama. He's actually just breaking down the numbers, and Hutch used to come on my radio show all the time. Congrats to his big award for the Writer of the Year. But still, 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama. And as you can tell, the numbers are very similar. Points, same. Yards, basically the same. Yards per play. Ironically, 2019 Alabama averaged 7.89 yards per play like 2019 LSU. Heisman, Davey O'Brien. Obviously, Clyde didn't win the Doak Walker. Najee did. Blitnikoff, Remington, Outland, Broyles. And for those that don't know, the Broyles goes to the best assistant in college football. Joe Brady was the first ever non-offensive coordinator to win this award. And Steve Sarkisian won the Broyles. I think the Remington went to Dickerson for Alabama, and the Outland went to Leatherwood. Which was the better offense? So he's not saying which was the better team. I'm going to go ahead and vote. I haven't voted yet. Let's go. Ooh, okay. A little recency bias. 76.6% say that the 2020 Alabama offense was better. Okay. So, what a lot of people will do is they will go to this asterisk, 13 games all versus a Power 5. So, LSU in 2019 actually played more games than Alabama, but they played one less Power 5 opponent than 2020 Alabama. So, let's do this. Let's go look at LSU's 12 games versus Power 5 competition. Here is everything for Power 5 competition. All right? And we've already filtered it for just Power 5. Now, this is 2020. Okay, so obviously, Alabama played all Power 5 competitions, 7.81 yards per play, 540. Ironically, Mississippi averaged more yards per game, but here we go, 541.6. Let's go to 2019 LSU, and will you look at this? LSU's numbers versus their Power 5 competition was actually better. Now, LSU did play one less Power 5 team than Alabama, but as you can tell here, LSU killed it versus just Power 5 competition. 570 yards per game and 8.05 yards per play. So, we go back here. What I would have done differently if I was Andrew Hutchinson, and I followed up with the tweet on this, is I would have done 2019 LSU versus just Power 5 competition and did those numbers, because you take a look, yards per play, better. Yards per game, better. The only thing that wasn't better was points, but as you can tell here, 48.4 to 47 points per game. And that's if you're just filtering the Power 5. So, when you see, and I've seen a few people do this, it's better to just filter out the non-3 Power 5 games. So, for those that don't know, you're taking out the Georgia Southern. You're also taking out the Northwestern game. So, why were LSU's numbers worse against non-Power 5 competition? Well, it's because LSU would blow them out and they would pull Joe Burrow from the game. It's ironic because Joe Burrow played, obviously, 15 games last year. In 13 of those games, he had 300 yards passing. The lowest amount of passing yards Joe Burrow had in a game in 2019 was against Georgia Southern. That first game where he was perfect. 5 touchdowns, no interceptions. He only had 278 yards. I say only. The only other game where Joe Burrow didn't throw for at least 300 yards was Florida, where he threw for 290-something. I'm just going off the top of my head here. But in that game, Joe Burrow rushed for like 50 or 60 yards. So, what about the defenses? Here is the 2019 LSU defense. They gave up 5.11 yards per play, okay? And on a yards per game basis, 343.5 yards per game. Very interesting. So let's go to Alabama. Their defense this year, better yards per play at 5.04 yards per game. They were also better at 352 yards per game. So I would give Alabama's defense the edge over LSU's defense, but it's not big. The difference between the two of them aren't big. If you go position group by position group, I would give Alabama's defensive line a slight edge over LSU's defensive line. I would give LSU's linebackers and Alabama's linebackers, I'd say they're about even. And Alabama's secondary versus LSU secondary from last year, I actually would put LSU's secondary slightly better than Alabama's secondary. So if you actually match them up, defensively, it's tight. However, if I were to make one argument for Alabama better than LSU, was Alabama more dominant than LSU in 2019? Let's take a look. So this is my buddy Chris Marler of Saturday Down South. Ohio State's 341 total yards last night were the fewest Ohio State has had in 3 years and 36 total games. Now, they did lose Trey Sermon early, okay, so that does play a factor into this. Their best running back, they honestly lost him on the first play of the game, but still, that's still a dominant defensive effort. And Alabama's 621 yards of offense was the most Ohio State has allowed in a single game in the last 21 years and 258 total games. I will give Marler this point. Alabama's win over Ohio State in the national championship game was a more dominant win than LSU's 17-point win over Clemson. My counter to that, though, was I think last year's Clemson and last year's Ohio State's team were better than this year's Clemson and this year's Ohio State's team. So, if you want to factor in national championship, that is an argument for Alabama. Also, Alabama's schedule was hellacious this year. Their only close game, their only game that was decided by a single-digit margin was Florida, and that was in the SEC championship game. And that was Florida's last stand. They had Kyle Pitts. Their best player was healthy in that game. The only difference was that was Alabama's third consecutive game away from Bryant-Denny Stadium. For those that don't know, that is extremely rare to play 3 consecutive games basically on the road. Because the LSU and Alabama game was rescheduled, well, LSU, they had to play the game in Baton Rouge, then fly back home. Then they had to fly out to Arkansas. They blew them out. And then they had to fly out again and play Florida. That is extremely rare. And when you actually do some research, teams that play back-to-back road games tend to struggle, and Alabama had to do it back-to-back-to-back. So the only game that was close was against Florida, that was clicking on all cylinders, that was healthy, and that was the third time that they had to go on the road. So that was the only close game that they had all season long. This Alabama team was dominant. But I would give the edge to LSU, okay? And this is why. LSU beat this Alabama team in their house when they were better. Because, to me, the 2019 Alabama team is better than the 2020 Alabama team. They were better yards per play offensively. In fact, the 2019 Bama team was just as good yards per play as LSU when you factor in all the games. And that Alabama team had 3 more NFL wide receivers healthy on that team than the final product of this Alabama team this year. They also had Najee Harris. They also had pretty much the same offensive line. And I know that that unit got even better in 2020, but overall that team was better. Now, defensively, they weren't as good as they were this year, but the fact that LSU beat this team in their house, and the fact that it really wasn't a 5-point game, the same way that I view, and I know I make this point all the time, the same way that I view LSU versus Clemson in last year's national championship game, I've always said this, that game was a lot closer than a 17-point game. Well, the exact opposite is true for the Alabama game. LSU really blew them out. It took some last-ditch effort, some questionable coaching decisions from Ed Orgeron, some real acts of nature to make that game actually a 5-point game. LSU was dominant for, I would say, 3.5 quarters of that game. So, we could play the what-ifs and whatnot, but to me, the deciding factor is both teams coming off a bye week, LSU in Alabama's house, beating that team, which had a lot of the same players on the team, on this year's team for Alabama. So, I would give LSU the slight edge. I'm not the only person that says this. Some people have said that LSU, what's the film analyst for The Athletic I like a lot? I forget his name. I'll post this tweet when I'm done. He thinks LSU would blow Alabama out. And my one final difference between LSU and Alabama, when two teams play and they are basically equal talent across the board, the deciding factor is oftentimes the quarterback who can run, right? The quarterback who's mobile. Mac Jones isn't mobile. He's not. Now, his pass protection is unbelievable, so he doesn't have to be that mobile. But if we go back and look at the 2019 LSU versus Alabama matchup, the difference was Tua couldn't run and Joe Burrow could. And that made LSU's defense very unstoppable in that game. Or LSU's offense, very unstoppable. So I would, as objectively as I possibly could say it, I would still pick LSU. I still would. So, I hope you enjoyed this video today. Of course, as always, subscribe. We're so close to 3,000 subscribers. Let's go. It's Power Hour LSU. Boom! Joey B, let's go.